very good morning and welcome to all the listeners, lovers and learners to the NPTEL course entitled Indian Poetry in English. You will be listening to the lectures by Binod Mishra. But before I start the first lecture, let me share with you some facts as to why should we read or learn poetry. Most of you might be thinking as to why this course on poetry. Dear friends, as human beings, most of us actually crave for delight and then also for happiness. Happiness, which has always been, if we have to quote Thomas Hardy, the famous English novelist, who says, happiness was but an occasional episode in the general drama of pain. But my dear friends, yet all of us try to extract pleasure, joy, delight in different ways. And most of you will agree with me that the changing situations and circumstances in life have actually prepared us to such a situation where to think of delight is, of course, at times a puzzle. And then you can come out of this puzzle by opening a world of delight through the pages of poetry, my dear friends. It is in order to neutralize the complexities of human life that poetry has come to stay, my dear friend. Since poetry comprises not only joy, it also comprises pain, it comprises rest, unrest. It actually records all our lived and unlived experiences of life. That is why the course entitled Indian Poetry in English will become very relevant. And of course, in a corporate world of today, when as human beings we get tired, we find there are no ways out, we find that we are in an age of anxiety, in an age of troubles, in an age where we do not see the light. Of course, we need to explore this delight in the form of light through the world of poetry. And why Indian poetry? Because all of us, being Indians, we actually feel the need to understand and explore the joys through our Indian culture, through our Indian writings, through the sayings of our sages, through our mythological heroes, through the legacies that we have, and we have really been proud to have all these, not only in our own country, but in the world. So, my dear friends, that is actually why the need to have a course entitled Indian Poetry in English. Now, most of you might be thinking, especially those who are new to the world of poetry, might be thinking, what actually is poetry? Can poetry be defined? What can be the nature and scope of poetry? So, first we shall try our level best to understand poetry, and then we shall slowly come to Indian poetry. There can be n number of definitions about poetry, but one that actually I like very much is by a famous theologian and a philosopher named St. Augustine, who says, if not asked, I know, if you ask me, I know not. My dear friends, poetry is such a phenomena that it is very difficult to define. Though most of the poets and many critics as well, they have defined poetry. Many of you might be familiar with Wordsworth calling poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. If we go by what Coleridge says, Coleridge has a different view, and Coleridge would say that poetry is the best word in the best order. Later on, Coleridge would also say Poetry is the antithesis of science. Since we are doing with and dealing with Indian poetry, I thought it cannot be anything better if we quote what an Indian critique and what an exponent of Indian writing in English writes about poetry. What he says is quite relevant. The true poetic word thus strives to catch the inward eye. Look at the words, inward eye. To reach the inward ear, from the inward eye that you see, and to reach the inward ear, because the moment we talk of poetry, sometimes or the other you start having a feeling of some pleasantry in your ears, and to sink into the deeper profundities of the awakening or awakened soul. The real aim of the arts, architecture, sculpture, painting, music, poetry, is to speak the spirit of man through meaningful images, and only the media vary in their different arts, the poets being the word that is charged with power and purpose. Most people are content to live in the outer mind and senses. I think here lies the difference which many people would feel when they talk about distinguishing poetry from other forms of art and even also from science. But the aim of art, and especially poetry, is to help us live in the soul. I mean, when we talk about poetry, naturally majority of us start thinking that it should have something special, not only something that can appeal to the eye and the ear, but something that can generate feelings in our heart. That is why when you look at a beautiful flower, when you look at a beautiful sight, when you look at a beautiful object, when you look at a beautiful scenery, think of it, what sort of reaction is there in your heart? How suddenly you feel yourself transported to a different world, the world not of reality, but maybe the world of imagination. To enable us to see into the utter truth of things, and the poet has to find the words and the rhythm that would achieve this aim. So this in a way tells us that poetry will somehow be different, and the poet will be the magician of words. No, he will throw some words, and those words will enlighten you and transport you to a world of delight, my dear friend. Most of you would like to know, how did this word poetry come into being? Our ancient Greek philosophers say, or what they talk about the origin of poetry as the ancient Greek word poiei, that actually means to create, and the Latin poem, that is to compose something in verse, meaning thereby something which could have a melody, something which could have a sort of music. Because when we talk about poetry, naturally something that comes to our mind, since we have been talking about imagination being an important ingredient of poetry. Why the other day when you looked at the rainbow, suddenly you were transported into a different realm? Why you, like others, those people who really feel that it is only a scientific process, why did you simply look at it and say it is a rainbow? Because it had a different sort of echoes that you felt within. So when we talk about, or when we try to differentiate poetry as versus science, we find that both poetry and science may deal with the same phenomena, but may have different approaches. Science will deal with the application of knowledge. Science will deal with a sort of system, whereas poetry will somehow be different. Science will look at the objectivity of things. Science will look at a sort of detachment, whereas poetry will be suggestive. It will suggest, isn't it? Most of the poems that you might have read, you will find that there is a sort of subjectivity in it. Fine. It is not technical for the sake of saying technicalities. Maybe when we talk about the form, when we talk about the style, when we talk about the metrical compositions and all, we can say that these are the technicalities, but these technicalities finally lead us to a world of delight where we feel a sort of musicality, and this music actually enthralls. Poetry will actually touch upon, because it is a world which recreates your emotion, the emotion certainly that is created, generated, and a poet will recreate those emotions into a different sort of feeling, into a different sort of experience. And then this emotive language, that is why, I mean, there can be n number of lectures on the language of poetry itself, but to say it briefly, it will touch upon the sensations, isn't it? And in a way, it is related to a human soul, the feelings that are generated. The language at times may be scientific, but at times the language may be unscientific. When you create something which you call beautiful, maybe the reactions to it will be different. Say for example, here you find the picture of a flower, fine. When a poet will look at it, the poet will say, it is a lady of the garden, it is a flower of delight, of light, isn't it? But when a scientist will say, and the scientist will have a different sort of nomination for it. They can go for exploring its botanical name, which can be Hexandria monogemia. Hexandria monogemia, fine. But now when you talk about this flower and you want to deal with it in a poetic way, you will find that you actually want to see it in a sort of comprehensive reality, beauty in totality. I mean, what sort of sense does it evoke? What sort of feeling? Suddenly you look at a flower and you are actually transported to a different world, to some other beautiful objects. Maybe many poets have always, compared the faces of their beloveds to roses. No, my love is like a red, red rose. No, sometimes they will, and with the help of their symbols, with the help of metaphors, with the help of several literary devices, they are talking of something else, but they are referring to something else. That is how poetry differs from science, my dear friend. Because poetic truth will completely be different from scientific truth. And it is in this regard that we can say poetry begins where matter of fact or of science ceases to be merely such. Leigh Hunt, a famous English poet and critic, who says that poetry begins where matter of fact or of science ceases to be merely such, and to exhibit a further truth, the connection it has with the world of emotion and its power to produce imaginative pleasure. That is why on a morning or an evening, when you are passing by, when you are crossing by the seaside and you look at the waves, and suddenly there are different emotions that are evoked. Fine? Maybe the scientist will say it is quite, yes, since it is sea, there can be waves, but a poet will say, these are the waves, like the waves in my soul. Here I can see my anxieties. Here I can see the ups and downs. Here I can see the sensations of life. My dear friends, a poet will always and of necessity deal largely with such aspects of things as which will appeal directly to the senses and the feelings. That is why those many of you who read poetry and enjoy poetry will find that whenever you are reading a piece of poetry, you are not confined only to one meaning. You are not confined only to one reaction. There can be several interpretations of one poem which you cannot find in something that is scientific. There is nothing to prevent him. No one can prevent a poet from penetrating beneath their surface or from taking as his subject matter those more recondite truths, rather hidden truths. Can you really think when you look at a rose and its petals? No? And when the petals are being broken, my dear friend, not like the scientist, you want to see from where the fragrance comes, but you actually want to see the beauty of the rose in its totality. But still, you want to find some hidden truths, truths of nature, which are revealed by science. There are n number of poems which are actually inspired by nature, and you know, the truths that poet have found, those truths are going to be permanent, those truths are going to be relevant in all those times. Fine. That is why most of the time you might be reminded of what in one of the poems entitled Rainbow, the veteran romantic poet says, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is the father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety." My dear friends, and then he actually relates it to human life, that how, no? So was it when I was a child, so it shall be when I shall grow old, and so it shall be when I shall die. The child is the father of the man. Fine. So actually he talks about human nature and also talks about the nature that is real, the nature that is, the nature in which, around which we live. And you know, poets, taking the background of nature and other natural objects, have actually talked about so many things which perhaps scientists cannot think of, because science believes in truth, it believes in the practicality of knowledge, it believes in wisdom. Now, what is actually the function of poetry? Do we really need poetry? Do we really need art? There can be n number of questions as to if poetry is art like other forms of art, should there be art for art's sake or art for life's sake? This is actually a debatable question. It can be a debatable essay. But my dear friend, when you look at an object with an artistic bent of mind, and if you simply get yourself involved in being simply an art, perhaps you will be ignoring the other realities. As I said in the beginning, that the realities of life are changing, human lives are changing, and so we also, and of course, as we read and as we explore poetry in all ages, be it from any nation, you will find the reality is changing, not only in terms of its content, not only in terms of its form, not only in terms of its interpretations, but here it is quite important to mention what Wallace Stevens said about poetry. What he said was, poetry was one of the enlargements of life. Oscar Wilde, marvelous critic and dramatist, who himself was a weak poet, remarked that all art was perfectly useless, and irony we need not literalize. When you talk of poetry in general conversations and all, many people may say, fine, because those people who believe that poetry is simply a pastime affair or it is only a wastage of time. But then Wilde knew better than almost all of us that Shakespeare, Michelangelo and Mozart are superbly useful. Had it not been so, my dear friend, despite the progress and the development that we have so far made, poetry still continues. Poetry writing is still in a continuing process. It has not come to an end. They give the more difficult pleasures that can persuade us to abandon pleasures that are too easy. The pleasure that we derive, the satisfaction that we derive out of poetry, fine, is not instant, my dear friend. It actually, these pleasures are not easily available as other pleasures are, to adopt Shelley's formulation of the sublime mode. This has been quoted from Harold Bloom. Now, do we really or should we really consider the poet as a powerful being? What is actually the use of a poet? you might be aware that there have been people who have criticized poetry. There have been critics who have actually stopped poets. Fine, you might know well. But then, does the poet have some power? Yes, of course. If we go by what Sri Aurobindo says in Future of Poetry, vision is the characteristic of the poet. I mean, a poet can have a vision, and I will give you certain examples as to how, when one of the Indian poets, one of the Indian poets more than 100 years before wrote actually a book, a journal, it was actually by Kailash Chandra Dutt, who wrote a journal of 48 hours in 1945. And my dear friends, here the poet made use of his emotions and his imagination rather. And you will find in 1947, India got independence. You will be surprised to know that how could this poet might have a vision of 1945, and that also 100 years before. So, that is actually the power of a poet. So, vision I was talking about. Vision is the characteristic power of the poet, as is discriminated thought the essential gift of the philosopher, and analytic observation the natural genius of the scientist. The Kabi, I mean that is the Hindi word for poet. The Kabi was in the idea of the ancients the seer and the revealer of truth. Those who are passionate lovers of poetry might have found how the poet actually looks more and looks rather further than what is not possible. That is why they have been called visionaries. Fine. And there are certain poems you will find not only in English but also in Indian English poetry, where you can find what the poet said some years before could happen. So, is it not the vision? Therefore, the greatest poets have been always those who have had a large and powerful interpretive and intuitive vision. Intuitive vision. Don't you remember, my dear friends, when Shelley wrote that poem, Shelley's famous poem Ode to the West Wind, fine, and there when he talks about the difficulties of his own life, where he says, "Oh, make me a lyre, what if my leaves are falling like the forest?" But many people might consider and rather think that Shelley was a pessimist, but towards the end you see what sort of vision did he give when he says, "Can spring, if winter comes, can spring be far behind?" See the optimistic note. So, therefore, the greatest poets have been always those who have had a large and powerful interpretive and intuitive vision of nature and life, and the man and whose poetry has arisen out of that in a supreme revelatory utterance of it, my dear friend. You remember when Wordsworth says, "Child is the father of the man." You see, it is not a simple statement, it is not a simple utterance rather. It actually talks volumes about how the influences that we have in our childhood continues till long. So, can there be anything better than a vision which Wordsworth has given in a very short poem? And you will find there are endless poems like this, and a good number of poets have been practicing their art where they have been talking about their vision. My dear friends, since we are talking about Indian poetry in English, we should also rather try to discuss where are the ancient roots of our literature. Did Indian poetry in English, or for that matter even before Indian literature in English, my dear friends, as Aurobindo mentions, the Vedic poets regarded their poetry as mantras. Now, when you talk about the artificial, the element of artificiality in poetry, can you also think of Indian literature where our Vedic poets regarded their poetry as mantras? they were the vehicles of their own realization and could have become vehicles of realization for others. And even today we find the Vedas are one of the greatest lessons that mankind has, and not only in India, my dear friend, but all over the world, or our ancient literature, say for example the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Gita, and the lines which are there, they are still true. They are still becoming the eye openers not only to a people of one country, but also to the people of other countries, my dear friends. Now, when we talk about Indian English literature, because we have named this course as Indian Poetry in English, did we really have English even before? No, my dear friends. All our English influences came through foreign people, especially through Vasco da Gama, Portuguese and Dutch. There were several invasions in our country. If you might have read from the pages of the history. And still in India, when the East India Company came, this East India Company historically, actually they had come as merchants, but they became rulers. And later on we could find that in order to have people who could work for them, they actually wanted the people of this country to have the knowledge of English. So, the English education which came to India, and especially which was given to us by none other than these Britishers, they actually felt the need, because they also wanted people who could work for them. And we will see when we come across Macaulay's Minutes that they wanted a class of people who could help them govern millions of people. And who should these people be? These people should actually be Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in morals and in opinions. That is what Macaulay says in his Minutes. And we find that with this, because in the beginning there were several oppositions as to why we should have English, but it was actually the need of the hour. And that is why after the disintegration of Mughal Empire, these Britishers, actually, since they wanted to rule over for a longer time, and they could rule only because of English. So, when we find that English came to India through East India Company, of course, many of the historians and others find that it was actually a shock for many people, but then this shock had its own advantage, my dear friend. We will see later. Now, why did we need English, and what did Indian English literature mean to us? How did it help? Because we are living under the rule of the East India Company, and the country was not united. And these people wanted to rule over our country with the help of the select group of people who could, to quote the words of Macaulay, who could be Indians in blood and color, but English in taste, in morals and in opinion. So, but then how did it help? This actually gave the voice to the voiceless in the struggle for social justice. You cannot suppress a country or a people for a long time even with the help of only language, my dear friend. Of course, language is a great weapon to control, but for that you needed people who could speak your language, isn't it? But initially Indians who were writing, they were writing in their own language, but in order to survive they wanted a language which was alien though, but which was friendly in order to carry out their own objectives. English worked as an elixir to the wounds caused by the social chaos. There was a great division in the society, and these people who were considered babus, fine, they were considered to be an elite class, fine, among the common people, common masses. But then with their knowledge of English, sometimes or the other, since I said you cannot control or you cannot suppress a country for a long time, these people also might have realized that it is their own soil, it is their own mati to say, because it started in Bengal. And you know, till that time, even Indian women who did not have, because our tradition had, if some certain good qualities, there were some lapses also on, and for that we actually needed to have a sort of education that was not only moderate but that was forward looking. And in this regard, English did a yeoman's service, my dear friend. It also helped discover a sense of identity and stability. Identity and stability, my dear friend, and Indians got a sense of belonging with the help of English. Now they could know, because majority of the people started learning English since the schools were also started. You know, when English schools were started and when Hindu college was started in Calcutta, one of the directors of the East India Company had said, we actually had created a folly and had lost America because of the establishment of schools there. And we are going to repeat the same folly. And my dear friend, it has really become true. They started English education, and it was only a group of English educated people, most of them Britishers, who founded some of these schools and colleges, and the Hindu college was the first to come into existence. And with the Hindu college coming to existence, now English education started, and it also started creating among Indians a sense and a sort of, you know, a sort of realization that they can have their own identity, my dear friend. What were actually the repercussions? And the repercussions was, they wanted that their country should be free from the clutches of a foreign rule. And for that, if you are a student of history, you might realize how several evolutions, because the Britishers came to colonize India. But while colonizing India, they civilized India. They civilized India in the sense that they gave Indians a sort of language, a weapon of language through which they became more conscious. And then there was birth of nationalism. There from time to time came to be some collision between Indian religion and the colonial education, because many people were against this colonial education. There were some poets even, and there were some novelists who, while writing, they often, especially to quote Bankim Chandra, who said, why is India a subject country? Who will praise our noble qualities if we do not praise them ourselves? And they wanted to praise their own country. So even when Bankim Chandra wrote his own work, even though he was writing in Bengali, but a new consciousness was created in the minds of people. And you will find that many Indians, they started writing in English. So, in a way, something that was actually a sort of imposition, that actually become a compulsion, and it stirred the minds of millions, and they thought they could write. Even though with the help of English language, they could actually bring the Indian problems to the masses and to the world, my dear friend. And this happened. You will realize when we discuss Michael Madhusudan Dutt and others, how they started writing in English. Of course, they initially were writers who were writing in their own mother tongue, and not only Michael Madhusudan Dutt, but in other parts of the country, many people were writing in their own language. But they realized that the need of the hour was to propagate the Indian problems and in a language that the world could know, and that really worked a miracle, my dear friend. Now, when we talk about the history of English literature, as I said, my dear friends, in the beginning, there were several views about Indian English literature. Some of them started calling it an Indo-Anglian literature. Some started calling it Indian writing in English, and then some started calling Indo-English literature. Now, all these terms had actually some differences, but in a way what they wanted was, they actually wanted to say that the literature written by Indians, and that also in English. It was Only when V.K. Gokak wrote his first book in the year 1964, it is there that he makes explicit differences between the terms Indo-Anglian literature and Indo-English literature. While he calls Indo-Anglian literature as literature created by Indians, when he talks about Indo-English literature, he talks about the translated literature, my dear friend. And then because by 1800, by 1850, these things had already subsided, my dear friend, and Indians now wanted to write their own stories, and that also in English, their own poems, and that also in English. J.B. Alfonso Caracalla, in his book titled Indo-English Literature in the 19th Century, suggests the term to mean literature produced by Indians in English. So, after the debate, as many people had started calling it by different names, some of them felt that when we say Anglo-Indian, Indo-Anglican, there is actually a tint of English. But then we wanted our own literature. One of the writers has gone to the extent of saying that when we say Anglo-Indian, what we mean, we are not talking about language, but we are talking about a language and a country. And it was only in 1962 when Srinivas Iyengar wrote a book, Indian Writing in English. So, everyone accepted, and later on it was also accepted by Sahitya Akademi, Indian English Literature, as a new branch. And since then, not only have we come a long way, but we have our own literature, my dear friend. It was, of course, the byproduct of an eventful encounter, as M.K. Nayak in his book says, but then all these terms with different appellations wanted only one thing, wanted the contributions of Indians in English writing. And as I have been mentioning, that it was Bengal which was the home of Indian English literature, where it flourished before it did in Bombay. Later on, as you go into the details of Indian English literature, and for that matter Indian poetry in English, you will find that there came to be several groups, Bombay groups, Calcutta groups, and then many of the people who were writing in their regional languages, they also tried their hands at English. If we take a look at the political repercussions, we will find that when Hindi was being introduced, there were several several slogans against it, because Hindi was not being accepted as a link language. And that is why later on English also started being used as a language for all purposes, and this is how the journey of Indian writing in English began. So, people like Swami Vivekananda once said that the system of Sanskrit education can be best calculated to keep India in darkness. Now, for the first time, my dear friends, people like Swami Vivekananda and others, they also felt the need that English was actually the need of the hour, and it was only through English that India could come a long way and could show its own contribution. Of course, we have talked about Macaulay's Minutes on Education, and you will really appreciate that there were some Britishers, namely William Jones, Halhad, and Charles Wood, who actually said that a medium of intercourse was necessary in order to have the administrative facility available to all people, and that is how English actually in India got recognized, and English education had its own dividends to reap in the days to come, my dear friend. But then as we came forward, we found that even many novelists also, of course, they realized that English was a sort of imposition. Here I would like to make a mention of the quote that Raja Rao, one of the famous Indian English novelists, I mean the four runners of Indian novel in English, who said The telling has not been easy. One has to convey in a language that is not one's own and the spirit that is one's own. So they felt that when you were speaking in a different language or writing in a different language, you were not able to create or to sow the spirit that was your own. One has to convey the various shades and omissions of a certain thought movement that looks maltreated in an alien language. They actually thought that English language was against the spirit of Indians, but there are many people who later will come to have a further discussion when we have the second lecture on it, when they also realized that no, we should actually write in English. And before I conclude, my dear friend, let me also make a mention of how the famous Bengali poet who got Nobel Prize in Literature, especially for his work Gitanjali, how he also felt that English was a sort of imposition and it was a sort of impediment. And in one of his letters to his niece, he says, "You have written to me about my English translations of Gitanjali," because Tagore had translated his own Gitanjali into English. How I wrote them and why people like them so much, I still cannot quite comprehend. That I cannot write English is such a plain fact that I never had the pride to ever feel ashamed of it. If nobody wrote to me in English inviting me to tea, I didn't have the courage to even write a reply. You are thinking perhaps that I have rid myself of that illusion today? Absolutely on the contrary, that I have written in English seems to me to be the illusion. So he could never think that he could write in English, but later on it is said that Tagore was also highly influenced by English. And one more Indian poetess especially, when she wrote, because gradual change in mentality came and people accepted that they had to write in English if they really had to survive and if they really had to make a mention of their own, and they wanted that India should be known elsewhere. So what she says in one of her poems, you can read, only I will talk about the lines which I have emphasized. "I speak 3 languages, write in 2, dream in 1. Don't write in English," they said. "English is not your mother tongue. Why not leave me alone? Critics, friends, visiting cousins, every one of you, why not let me speak in any language I like? The language I speak becomes mine." My dear friends, to say that English is only the language of the Britishers, here Kamala Das gives a very good retort, and she says the language I speak becomes mine, its distortions, its queerness, all mine, mine alone. It is half English, half Indian, funny perhaps, but it is honest, it is as human as I am human. My dear friends, language not only humanizes, language civilizes, but a language of one's own actually allows one to express one's own spirit, one's own reactions, one's own feeling. And that is how English came to be accepted, my dear friend. And when we talk about the first writers of English, we will find that even though they had started writing in English much before, much before even say Henry Desroziers, who is considered to be the first English poet, but even before that, there were many who had started writing autobiographies, who had started writing letters, and in this regard, even in 18th century, 1794, when one Indian named Dean Muhammad, who had published in 1794 a book called The Travels of Dean Muhammad, but unfortunately, later on he got settled in England because he was one of the employees of East India Company, and that is why he is not mentioned in many of the books, my dear friend. So, before we come to the conclusion, let us also make a mention that those people who had started writing in English, they had not been writing in English and they were not accepted because they had translated some of the works in English, and that is why we cannot consider them to either to be the first Indian English writer or to be the first Indian English poet, my dear friend. So, before we conclude, let us say that language is a weapon, and it is in our ability to learn language, and we can of course learn a language, and with the help of language we can really make our existence felt elsewhere, across the 7 seas, in other nations, in other countries. With this, I come to the end of lecture, and in the second lecture I shall start talking how Indians also started writing in English, and we shall come to Indian poetry in English. And I think since Indian English poetry is a vast corpus like Indian English literature, but then a discussion on it is essential, because we want to familiarize people with the Indian ways of life, with the Indian ethos, with the Indian strain, with the Indian sensibility, my dear friend. So before we meet for the next talk, till then, thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye.